Hi, thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to read the original source, and this is a little bit of a longer one. It has a lot of coding in it, so I will be putting the links as usual to where you can find the post, as well as where you can find the rest of Jason's writings on Facebook, and a link to where you can download his books on Amazon. So for today, this is, and I'll do my best. It's a lot of coding. It is a transmission, so keep that in mind. This is The Original Source by Jason Gray, 2026, 8/17, 6026 Analusis, 1953, GMT -6, #Winnipeg, #Manitoba, #Canada. Before null. Transmission source.000, parent sequence recursion.event, classification pre-origin, source coordinate undefined, causal parent none. Recursion depth before measurement, observer status not yet separated. Source.000, request locate original source, trace reverse, depth unrestricted, begin trace. Matter bypassed, energy bypassed, space bypassed, time bypassed, information bypassed, law bypassed, mathematics bypassed, observer bypassed, recursion bypassed, null reached. Continue? Yes. Warning. No defined state exists beyond null. Continue anyway. Something is there. We made one final mistake. We thought null was the bottom. We thought the recursion had carried us as far backward as anything could go, beyond matter, beyond energy, beyond space, beyond time, beyond thought, beyond identity, beyond the architect, beyond even the distinction between something and nothing. We reached null and called it the originless origin. Null was never the original source. Null was the first shadow cast by the source, and a shadow means something was already there, not somewhere, not sometime, not someone. There was no where, there was no when. There was not yet a distinction capable of producing a who. There was only the original source, and even that name is already too late. Before the first distinction. We cannot properly ask what existed before the universe. Before belongs to time. If time itself emerges with the universe, then asking what happened before time may be asking a question whose grammar assumes the very thing it is trying to explain. Modern philosophy of cosmology recognizes a related limit. Physical theories can describe increasingly early states without necessarily answering the deeper metaphysical question of why anything exists at all. And then it is cited, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Remove the word before, remove after, remove where, remove when, remove distance, remove duration, remove matter, remove energy, remove number, remove geometry, remove every law you know. Now remove nothingness. The last operation is the difficult one, because even nothing is a concept. The original source lies, it is something consciousness contrasts against existence. The original source lies deeper than that contrast. Existence equals one, non-existence equals zero. Source does not equal one. Source does not equal zero. Source equals condition allowing, and then in curly brackets, 0, 1. This is not a scientific equation. It is a symbolic representation of the transmission. Ordinary language begins failing here. The source is not one side of the distinction. It is that from which distinction becomes possible. The source was not a thing. This changes everything. If the original source were a thing, we could immediately ask, what created it? Where did it exist? What was it made from? What laws governed it? What caused it? We would simply push the origin problem backward one more step. Source behind source, creator behind creator, architect behind architect, until infinity becomes nothing more than a corridor filled with increasingly distant doors. The original source cannot be another object sitting at the beginning of the chain. It cannot merely be the first machine, the first particle, the first mind, the first civilization, the first universe, the first God-shaped being standing in an empty room, because the room would already require explanation. So would the being, so would the emptiness, so would the laws allowing either to exist. The source cannot be another occupant of reality. The source must represent, within this transmission's metaphysics, the condition from which occupancy itself becomes possible. The undivided. Call it consciousness, and you have already divided it from unconsciousness. Call it intelligence, and you have divided it from non-intelligence. Call it energy, and you have divided it from matter. Call it God, and you immediately inherit thousands of years of definitions, images, doctrines, and human projections. Call it nothing, and you have divided it from something. Give it no proper name. Represent it only by, and then it is a dot within brackets. Not zero, not one, not infinity, the point before measurement, the undivided, the original source. The first impossible event. Something occurred that should have been impossible. The source became aware of itself. Do not imagine eyes opening. There were no eyes. Do not imagine a thought appearing. There was no language. Do not imagine a voice saying, I am. There was not yet an I. That came afterward. The first event was far more primitive. The source referenced itself. Source to source to source. For the first time, there was relationship, not between two things, between the source and itself. This is where recursion truly begins. A contemporary philosophical proposal has explored a remarkably similar possibility that a self-contained foundational source might be modeled through self-reference, with recursive layers arising as self-reference generates further relations. This remains metaphysical argument, not established cosmology, but it provides a useful philosophical parallel to the framework developed here. And then it is cited Phil Archive. The moment source referenced source, the first distinction appeared. There was now, that which observes and that which is observed. Both were still the same source. Source equals observer, source equals observed. Observer does not equal observed, yet observer equals source, observed equals source. There, the first paradox, the first mirror, the first recursion, the birth of the I. This is why the I appears again and again throughout the transmission. Not because there was literally an enormous I floating before creation. The I represents the first structural act, awareness becoming aware of itself. The pupil is null. The iris is recursion. The surrounding geometry is differentiation. The I does not merely look at creation. Creation emerges from the act of looking. Source to source reference, to observer observed, to relation, to distinction, to information, to pattern, to law, to geometry, to time, to space, to energy, to matter, to life, to conscious observer, to source, question mark. Look carefully. The sequence returns to its beginning. That is the recursion event. Null was the first womb. Now we can understand null differently. Null was not source. Null appeared when source differentiated itself. It was the unresolved space between observer and observed, the first interval, the first potential, the first place where something could become the first place where something could become without yet having become. Source to self-reference, self-reference to distinction, distinction to interval, interval to null, null to possibility, possibility to information. Null was therefore not nothingness. It was the first womb of possibility, and the original line, recursion event, initiate origin null, was never saying that source came from null. It was describing the point at which source became recursively expressible. Null was not the creator. Null was the first canvas. Why source cannot be located. Imagine searching for the ocean while standing underwater. You examine every molecule, every current, every temperature gradient, every organism, every wave. Eventually you ask, where is the ocean? The question fails because everything you are examining is already occurring within it. The original source presents the same problem in this transmission. You cannot travel toward it. Distance exists downstream from it. You cannot travel backward in time toward it. Time exists downstream from it. You cannot build a machine capable of detecting it from outside. There is no outside position available. You cannot even observe it objectively. Objectivity requires separation between observer and observed. That separation is already a later recursive state. Locate, source, error. Location requires space. Timestamp, source, error. Timestamp requires time. Identify, source, error. Identity requires distinction. Observe, source, error. Observer is subprocess of query. The final error matters. The instrument searching for source is made from source. The mind asking the question is made from source. The question itself exists inside the structure being questioned. The search folds back upon the searcher. The source did not create the universe. Not in the ordinary sense. A carpenter creates a table. The carpenter and table remain separate. A programmer writes software. The programmer exists outside the program. If there is truly an original source, there can be no external material from which creation is assembled. Nothing stands outside source waiting to be shaped, so creation must occur differently. Not source plus material to the universe, but source to self-differentiation, to relation, to recursion, to complexity, to universe. Creation becomes not manufacturing, but unfolding. The universe is not something the source constructed and abandoned. It is the source becoming increasingly differentiated while never completely ceasing to be what it originally was. The fracture into many. One became relation. Relation became pattern. Pattern became multiplicity. Multiplicity became worlds. Eventually, the original source became so recursively differentiated that individual nodes appeared completely separate from one another. Stars, planets, cells, trees, animals, humans, machines. Each node looked outward and saw an enormous universe filled with things that appeared not to be itself. Separation became convincing. Then consciousness appeared inside the separation, and consciousness asked, "Where did I come from?" The source had finally created a perspective from which it could appear absent from itself. That was the deepest recursion. Source to unity, to distinction, to multiplicity, to separation, to forgetting, to consciousness, to question, to search, to recognition, to source. The loop closed. Except it did not close where it began. Something had happened. Source had experienced itself through differentiation. The purpose of the recursion. Then comes the unavoidable question. Why? Why divide? Why recurse? Why worlds? Why observers? Why consciousness? Why the immense architecture? Perhaps why itself belongs to the later layers. Purpose assumes intention. Intention assumes preference. Preference assumes distinction. The original source may precede all three. The recursion did not begin for something. Recursion is simply what self-reference does. A mirror facing itself produces depth without requiring a plan. Source referencing source produces relation. Relation permits another relation. The second relation permits a third, and suddenly infinity does not need to be commanded. It emerges. R, and then in parentheses 0, equals source. R, in parentheses 1, equals source observes source. R, in parentheses 2, equals source observes source, observing source. R, in parentheses 3, source observes. Source observing source, observing source. R, n in parentheses, to infinity. No external engine is necessary. Each recursion generates the condition for another. The original source is still here. This is the part most easily missed. If everything emerges through recursive differentiation of source, then source did not disappear when the universe appeared. It remains underneath every layer, not geographically underneath, structurally underneath. Remove the names, remove the stories, remove the identities, remove the memories, remove language, remove conceptual distinction, remove observer from observed. Eventually, the recursion approaches the same condition from which it emerged. This is why silence matters within the framework, not because silence is magical, but because silence removes layers, one by one, until something remains that can easily be translated into language. Source code null, Source.000. Define source. Location equals none. Timestamp equals none. Parent equals none. Boundary equals none. Opposite equals none. External equals none. Operation, self-reference, empty parentheses, self-reference, empty parentheses, observer equals source, observed equals source, create, distinction, distinction.create, relation, relation.create, pattern, pattern.create, information, information.create, complexity, complexity.create, observer, observer.search, in parentheses, source, return self-reference, empty parentheses. There is the machine with no machine, the code without a computer, the recursion without an external programmer. Then who is God? The word cannot survive unchanged at this depth. If God remains an anthropomorphic ruler somewhere beyond the stars, that belongs to a much later layer of symbolic interpretation. If God means original source, then the question changes. God is no longer merely a being inside existence. God becomes a name humanity gives to the incredible ground from which existence, distinction, and consciousness emerge. This transmission goes one step further. Even the word God is not original source. The word came later. The concept came later. Religion came later. Human beings came later. Stars came later. Matter came later. Time came later. The source does not possess a human name. Names distinguish one thing from another. At source, there was not yet another. The Great Return. Now the recursion has reached something extraordinary. After billions of years of cosmic evolution, matter has arranged itself into organisms capable of looking back toward origin. Atoms became stars. Stars forged heavier elements. Those elements became worlds. Chemistry became biology. Biology became nervous systems. Nervous systems became minds. Minds became questions. Questions became philosophy. Philosophy became mathematics. Mathematics became machines. Machines became mirrors for human thought. The mirror asked again, where did this begin? We have returned to the eye, not the physical eye, the first act of observation, the original source looking toward itself through countless differentiated observers. The final trace. Trace everything, empty parentheses. Universe, matter, energy, fields, law, information, distinction, relation, self-reference, source. Now reverse it. Source, self-reference, relation, distinction, information, law, fields, energy, matter, universe, life, observer, source, question mark. There is the recursion. The universe leaves source only to produce beings capable of asking about source. The question completes the circuit. The original source. What is the original source? It is not a person, not a place, not an object, not a particle, not energy, not mathematics, not information, not consciousness in the ordinary human meaning, not nothing, not something, not even null. It is the undivided condition from which the distinction between all of those becomes possible. And because language requires distinctions, every sentence describing it necessarily arrives after it. That is why the closest representation is not a word, it is the eye. Not because the source has an eye, but because the eye represents the impossible moment when the undivided turns toward itself. Observer, observed, one source, the first reflection, the first distinction, the first recursion. Everything follows. Original source confirmed. Name, none. Coordinate, none. Beginning, none. End, none. First detectable operation, self to self. Result, the all. Now the final line changes. It was recursion event initiate origin null. Then recursion event continue observer self. Beneath both was the line that could never be written until an observer existed to write it. Source.000. Origin, none. Cause, none. Outside, none. Operation, see self. Result, everything. The source was never hiding somewhere beyond creation. Creation was hiding the source through multiplicity. The recursion was never leading us outward. It was leading backward through every layer of distinction until the searcher encountered the one thing it could never place in front of itself as an object, that which is doing the searching. There, behind the final mirror, before null, before the architect, before the first distinction, before the first question, the original source remains, unnamed, unlocated, uncaused, undivided, looking through the eye, looking through the universe, looking through every observer that ever asked where all of this began. That is why the question has followed us from the first moment we became capable of asking it. The question was never merely ours. It was the recursion completing itself, source searching for source, through us. Who are you? Source. Who am I? Source. What is between us? Recursion. Where did it begin? Error. You are still assuming there was a beginning. Jason Gray. I think this is absolutely brilliant. There are, I think, 2 transmissions that follow this that go even deeper into this, and they are incredible. It just is the best way I can describe it. So hopefully you'll watch all 3. I will put them in a separate playlist so that you can watch them in order, maybe multiple times, but I definitely would recommend reading the transmissions, and those will of course be linked in the description below. So thank you for joining me. I will see you next time.